My name is Holly Ward. I'm a practicing visual artist. I've been making work for over 25 years. I would like to acknowledge my presence as a white settler artist working in Indigenous territories as an uninvited guest, and all of the privileges that allows me, which I'm very grateful for. I work in a very interdisciplinary fashion. I work across a lot of different media, drawing, sculpture, video, sound, architecture, installation. So it's very diverse, my practice. And I usually just work very intuitively through a set of ideas to sort of choose what media might best express a thought or an idea or a concept that I want to kind of realize. So it's a very diverse practice. Yeah, it's really diverse in terms of like where the projects start from. It usually comes from a more like idea-based place, like rather than someone who's like constantly working with the same material and then the kind of forms come out of that. It usually is coming through research that I might be doing, or even kind of social contexts that I want to address. And then I sort of take a lot of time kind of working through different material or artistic approaches to sort of bring that into like a form. Right, so it's very experimental in that sense. I usually just try and I feel like I'm sort of inventing a visual or aesthetic approach to a set of ideas each time for each project, and it's usually quite different from the last in a sense. But I've also sort of started to realize, after practicing for as long as I have been now, that I may be thinking it's like a really new approach or a very different kind of aesthetic language, but there's always a thread, right? So I just sort of kind of rummage around, I think, in a kind of broad toolkit and then sort of hone that visual language to bring that project to fruition. Yeah, this project was commenced last summer. And so it's still quite fresh. I was just sort of doing some preliminary material kind of inquiries into thinking about bodies of water. And so sort of started from really thinking about, natural systems and environments and how in our kind of economy of resource extraction, these kind of environmental systems are kind of placed in vulnerable positions, right? And so I was really thinking about water as a kind of entity and wanting to do a bunch of creative engagements that really kind of brought me into closer proximity to water. And that was all sort of within a broader context of thinking about the expansion of the TMX pipeline, which is something I've been following sort of in the news for the last bunch of years, and just really like having so many I don't know if questions is the right word, but maybe feelings about the way that project was sort of approved and purchased as a kind of public entity, and that consultations were very much lacking. And there's a lot of a significant portion of people across very broad territory who didn't want that project and still don't want that project. And so this kind of just, the project is sort of coming out of my own kind of feelings of frustration around, well, why if the public sentiment has a significant enough, percentage of people who don't want something to happen, why is that so impossible? So really trying to kind of engage with those difficulties, right? And not really thinking about, you know, of course, something like water is a very beautiful entity, but it also ends up being something that's very complicated. It becomes very compromised in the ways that we use it and our proximity to it. So I was just kind of wanting to develop some creative engagements, I guess, that would allow me to kind of spend time thinking about water or engaging with water in very direct ways, maybe very embodied ways, and then just as a way to sort of think about developing different kinds of affinities to it as a kind of entity. And I feel like, you know, something like that could be like a lifelong sort of project, right? So this is like a very preliminary sort of gesture towards developing that kind of closer proximity and thinking about you know, different ways that creative practice can bring you to understand something in a different way, maybe in a more fulsome way. And so the works in this show really started from thinking about, well, what would some of those creative engagements be? And so they involved kind of spending time in water, but, you know, maybe it's not so like how do you kind of make an artwork that might be interesting for others about like you sort of being in water, and of course not wanting to sort of center myself in that kind of aesthetic outcome, right? So yeah, just very much coming from this desire to formulate different creative engagements in proximity to water and sort of think about the entity of water as a kind of sovereign body. I started my kind of material practice, I guess, you know, I was always doing things like making clothing and making sort of different kind of objects. And then I started my formal art training in ceramics. And but I also developed a real kind of love for sculptural work. And so, yeah, I always kind of come back to ceramics, but it's not my primary form. I do a lot of kind of building projects as well. I've built some architectural forms, and in terms of, you know, the most challenging projects, I would say they are architectural just because of the scope of those projects. So I like sort of dreaming up like ambitious things and seeing if I can kind of tackle them. But I like to come back to like the basics of ceramics and drawing quite a bit. So the work in this show is really about drawing, and it's, you know, incorporating ceramics with sound and video and assemblage sculpture. So that's kind of like a wheelhouse, I guess, for me. Yeah. Well, in 2009, I was invited to be artist in residence at Langara College in Vancouver. And for that year-long residency, I built a 22-foot in diameter geodesic dome to work as a kind of facility for different creative engagements. So exhibitions, workshops, readings, things like that. And then in 2010, I was invited to move that structure up to a piece of property and about 40 minutes north of Kamloops. And so that sort of began a whole sort of process where I was kind of in this very rugged rural environment, and I was spending a lot of time there trying to build this project, rebuild this project. And I just ended up, you know, spending months kind of in this very land-based place. And it really changed my whole way of seeing like everything. It was a really big turning moment for me in terms of time slowing down, watching the systems of nature, watching time change and pass in different ways, and sort of also looking at the ways that economies are also existent in those spaces as well, and sort of understanding the complexity of those spaces as opposed to them being sort of these ideal, kind of pastoral, neutral, wild spaces. They're not. There are layers of politics, there are layers of economies, and also with the burgeoning ecological crisis, it's like this understanding of the complexity of how we view these spaces, and how that results in our actions and activities in those places and in broader kind of economic and political frameworks as well, right? Like British Columbia is mainly a resource extraction based economy, and so it really got me sort of thinking, because we're like living right next to clear cuts, and also looking at forest fires and all of that. So this real sort of moment of crisis in our culture, I think, that is very much about the ecological crisis, but a kind of crisis of ethics in terms of how white Western capitalist civilization like deals with those spaces, and of course being very interested in wanting to kind of learn more about Indigenous land stewardship and decolonial conversations around how can we understand this place and what lessons can we learn. And so I really feel like that is something, for me personally, I want to try to understand those relationships between how we as actants in culture, or even just individuals, how we kind of see where we are and how our actions kind of impact these kind of systems around us. What is the kind of framework for thinking about that? And so I don't really have necessarily a desired specific message for the work, but these are things that I'm thinking about. And I think through making work, I create a kind of, I'm one of many people doing this, but like create a visual language in order to maybe think about some of these things in different ways. And because the kind of mainstream conversation about how we should be thinking about these stuff is unsatisfactory and seems to be counterproductive. So yeah, I think that art is a place where we can think about the connections between things and think about our personal, how do we feel, how do we respond, how do we kind of create space to share a different conversation around things that matter to us. So that's sort of where that's going. It's very much trying to kind of find a new space to have layered and complicated conversations around forms and ideas and just sort of how we live and operate. Yeah.